December 20th, 1943, 10:30 a.m. The cold, grey skies over Bremen, Germany. Far below, the target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, a vital, pulsating cog in the Nazi war machine, churning out the FW-190 fighters that were tearing through American bomber formations. Above, a river of silver, the 379th Bombardment Group makes its stately, deadly way toward the target. Inside one of these Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, a plane with the name Ye Olde Pub painted on its nose, 21-year-old pilot 2nd Lieutenant Charles Charlie L. Brown is experiencing a terror so profound it eclipses anything he has ever known. This is his first mission. The air war over Germany in the winter of 1943 was not a clean, surgical affair of precision bombing. It was a brutal, grinding, industrial-scale meat grinder. For an American bomber crew, the statistical odds of completing their required 25 missions and going home were less than 25%. They were flying, literally, into a hornet's nest of anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak, and swarms of highly experienced German pilots who had been fighting for years. The B-17 was officially nicknamed the Flying Fortress, a name meant to inspire confidence, but to the men who flew them in those dark days, it was more often a flying coffin, a thin-skinned aluminium target offering a slim, cold chance of survival against a sky full of death. Today, the hornet's nest is particularly angry. As Ye Olde Pub begins its bombing run, the world outside the cockpit erupts. Flak bursts all around them, ugly black puffs of smoke with deadly invisible shrapnel hidden inside. The plane shudders violently as a piece of red-hot shrapnel tears through the No. 2 engine on the left wing. It sputters, coughs a plume of thick black smoke, and dies. Brown, fighting the controls, manages to keep the plane in formation just long enough to drop his payload of bombs onto the target below. Then, as they turn for home, the wolves descend. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their noses often painted with menacing shark mouths, slash through the bomber formation like sharks through a school of fish. They attack with calculated, terrifying precision, raking the B-17s with streams of 20mm cannon fire and streams of machine gun bullets that sound like hail on a tin roof. Inside Ye Olde Pub, all hell breaks loose. The plane is hit again and again, the sound of tearing metal and exploding ammunition, a constant, deafening roar. The No. 3 engine, also on the left wing, is ripped apart by a direct hit from a cannon shell. Now, with two engines out on the same side, the B-17 becomes a crippled, struggling beast, wanting to yaw violently to the left, to flip over and spin into the earth below. Brown and his co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Spencer Pinky Luke, are fighting the controls with all their strength, their muscles screaming as they wrestle with the yoke to keep the plane level. The oxygen system is shattered by the flak, leaving the crew to gasp for air in the thin, freezing atmosphere at 27,000 feet. In the back of the plane, chaos reigns. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckie Eckenrode, is dead, his body slumped over his guns, killed instantly by a cannon shell. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Leonard Bunny Rector, is critically wounded, his leg a mangled, bloody ruin, hanging by a thread of skin and sinew. The radio is destroyed, cutting them off from the world. The hydronic system is gone, meaning the landing gear and flaps are useless. The plane's plexiglass nose is shattered, letting in a blast of -50-degree air that turns the interior into an icebox and covers everything in a thin layer of frost. Brown, now forced to drop to a much lower altitude to keep his men from passing out from hypoxia, has no choice but to drop out of the protection of the bomber formation. He is alone, a straggler, a wounded gazelle that has become separated from the herd. And in the skies over Germany in 1943, a straggler is a dead plane. It is an invitation, a target that every German pilot for 100 miles is now hunting, as Ye Olde Pub limps westward, desperately trying to find a hole in the clouds and reach the safety of the North Sea coast. One of the German fighters breaks off from the main engagement. It's a Bf-109, painted a drab, mottled green and yellow, a shark's mouth grinning evilly on its engine cowling. Inside the cockpit is Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. He is not a rookie, not some green kid fresh from flight school. He is a seasoned veteran, an ace with 22 confirmed kills to his name. He is a pilot who has been fighting since the early days of the war, when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible and swept all before them. He is a professional, a technician of death, and he is doing his job. And today, his job is to finish off this crippled American bomber. For Stigler, this is more than just another kill. He is just one victory away from being awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Germany's highest and most prestigious military honours. It's a medal that will bring him prestige, respect, and perhaps a few days' well-deserved leave. This B-17, this broken, struggling piece of American machinery, is his ticket. It's an easy target, a sitting duck. He pushes the throttle of his Bf-109 forward, the Daimler-Benz engine roaring as he closes in for the kill. From his perspective, it's a simple final act in a long day's work. From Charlie Brown's perspective, looking out through his shattered windshield, it's the arrival of the angel of death. The end is here. Franz Stigler was a warrior, but he was not a monster. He was a man who believed, with an almost religious fervour, in a certain code, a chivalric code that seemed hopelessly anachronistic, out of place in the industrial-scale slaughter of the Second World War. This belief had been instilled in him, not by the Nazi Party, but by his first commanding officer, a grizzled, old-world World War I ace named Gustav Rodel. Rodel, a man who had duelled with Sopwith camels over the trenches, had gathered his young pilots and told them something they would never forget. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself," he had said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are fighter pilots. You are gentlemen. You fight with honour." For Stigler, this wasn't just a rule of engagement. It was the foundation of his identity as a pilot. He was an aerial knight, not a butcher. He had seen the brutality of the Eastern Front, where no such rules existed, where pilots strafed enemy airmen as they hung helplessly in their parachutes, and it had sickened him to his core. He fought for his country, for his fellow soldiers, but he fought with a sense of honour that set him apart from the barbarism he had witnessed. As he closed in on the crippled B-17, his finger was literally on the trigger of his 20mm cannon. He could see the damage with terrifying clarity: 2 dead engines, a shredded tail section, a fuselage riddled with holes like a piece of Swiss cheese. He could see the American bomber struggling to stay in the air, its pilot fighting a losing battle against the unforgiving laws of physics. This was his moment. A short, controlled burst, and it would be over. 23 kills, the Knight's Cross. He would be a hero, celebrated by the High Command. He manoeuvred his sleek, deadly Bf-109 into position, getting closer, closer, preparing for the final, killing burst. He was so close now that he could see inside the bomber's shattered nose. He expected to see the panicked faces of the crew, their eyes wide with terror as they prepared for their end. But what he saw instead stopped his heart and his hand cold. Through the jagged, bullet-riddled plexiglass, he saw a scene of utter, unspeakable horror. The inside of the plane was a bloody, frozen mess. He could see the wounded crewmen, their faces pale with shock and pain, frantically trying to tend to each other's injuries with a meagre first aid kit. He saw the body of the tail gunner, slumped and still, a lifeless form in a pool of frozen blood. He saw the plane's crew desperately trying to apply a tourniquet to the man in the ball turret, whose leg was a mangled, bloody ruin. They weren't looking at him. They didn't even see him coming. They were just boys, trying to survive. And in that single, profound moment, Franz Stigler saw not an enemy combatant, not a legitimate military target, but a group of terrified, wounded human beings. He saw the face of his own brother, August, a pilot who had been killed earlier in the war. He saw the face of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. His mind raced, a battlefield of conflicting imperatives. His training, his duty to his country, his personal ambition for the Knight's Cross, all of it screamed at him to fire. His country was at war. This bomber had just been dropping high-explosive bombs that could have, and probably did, kill German civilians and soldiers. It was his job to send it to the ground in flames. But the words of his old commander, Gustav Rodel, echoed in his ears. louder than the roar of his own engine. "You are gentlemen. You fight with honor." What honor was there in gunning down a defenseless, crippled aircraft? What glory was there in killing men who were already defeated? He looked at the bomber's tail, where the American insignia, the white star on a blue circle, was barely visible beneath the grime and smoke. He couldn't do it. It was not an act of treason or defiance against his nation. It was an act of conscience, a decision made in a split second that would define the rest of his life. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated grace in a sky filled with nothing but death. He made his decision. He pulled back on his stick, easing his Bf-109 alongside the B-17, so close that the two pilots could almost see each other's eyes. Charlie Brown, looking out through his broken windshield, saw the German fighter pull up alongside him instead of behind him. He braced for the end. He saw the German pilot in the cockpit, and he was shocked to see him not firing, but simply looking at him. He saw Stigler's eyes, and he saw not hatred or bloodlust, but something else. Something he couldn't possibly understand. Stigler looked at Brown, then gave a slow, deliberate salute, a gesture of respect between one pilot and another, a knight acknowledging a vanquished but worthy foe. Then he did something even more astonishing. He pulled his fighter in front of the B-17, forming up on its right wing, like a shepherd guarding a lost sheep. He was no longer the hunter. He was the escort. He was signalling to the German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground not to fire. He was guiding this wounded enemy towards safety. He was, in that single, profound act, choosing his humanity over his duty. He was risking everything, his career, his life, his honor as a German officer, to save the lives of the men in the crippled B-17. The two planes, one American and one German, flew on together, a strange, silent and impossible alliance in the hostile skies of the Third Reich. For several tense, surreal minutes, the two aircraft flew in formation, a bizarre and impossible sight against the backdrop of a war-torn Europe. It was a scene that defied all logic and reason. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown and his surviving crew were in a state of stunned, exhausted disbelief. They were wounded, freezing, and emotionally shattered, but they were alive. They watched the German Bf-109, a symbol of everything they feared and fought against, flying just off their right wingtip, not attacking, but protecting them. Brown, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, didn't know what to do. Was it a trick? Was the German pilot, a master of aerial combat, toying with them, luring them into a false sense of security before he unleashed a final, devastating burst from his cannon? But the minutes ticked by one, and the German fighter simply stayed there, a silent guardian angel with a swastika on its tail. Brown didn't order his remaining gunners to fire. He didn't reach for the controls to evasively maneuver. He understood, on some deep, instinctual level, that he was in the middle of something extraordinary, something that transcended the war itself, something that was bigger than uniforms and nationalities. For Franz Stigler, every single second was a monumental, calculated risk. He knew that if he was spotted by another German fighter, he would be immediately reported. He would be court-martialed and almost certainly executed for treason, for aiding the enemy. He knew that if an American P-47 Thunderbolt or P-51 Mustang, prowling the skies for any sign of the Luftwaffe, saw him escorting a German bomber, they would not hesitate to shoot him down without a moment's thought. He was completely exposed, a man without a country in that moment, floating in a no-man's land between two warring nations. He flew with one eye on the B-17 and one eye constantly scanning the sky, searching for any other aircraft that might turn this moment of mercy into a death sentence for both of them. He guided the bomber westward, nudging it gently toward the coast, out of the range of the German flak batteries that still lined the shore. He was giving them a chance, a gift of a few more minutes of life, a gift that could cost him his own. As they approached the coastline, the North Sea glittering in the weak winter sun below them, Stigler knew it was time to go. He had done what he could. He had brought them as far as he could without jeopardizing himself further. To fly on would be to risk certain discovery over the channel, which was swarming with Allied aircraft. He looked over at the B-17 one last time. He could see the faces of the crewmen in the windows, looking back at him with a mixture of profound fear, utter confusion, and dawning gratitude. He gave another quick, crisp salute, then waggled his wings in a final, clear gesture. It was a signal. "You're on your own now. Good luck." Then, he pushed the throttle of his Bf-109 forward, the engine roaring as it surged ahead. He climbed back into the sky, a dark speck disappearing toward the east, back to the world of duty and war. He had saved them. Now, he had to save himself, and pray that no one had seen his act of compassion. Charlie Brown and his crew watched him go, a collective, shuddering sigh of relief and wonder passing through the battered fuselage of the plane. They were alone again, but this time they had a chance. They were over the North Sea, out of German territory, but they were still in a crippled plane, with no navigation, no radio, and barely enough fuel to make it back to England. Brown flew on, his hands numb from the cold, his mind reeling from the experience. He didn't know who the German pilot was, or why he had spared them. He only knew that he and his men were alive because of a miracle, a moment of impossible grace in a sky filled with nothing but hatred and death. Against all odds, they made it. They spotted the coast of England and followed it south, their fuel gauges hovering on empty. Finally, they saw their home base at Kimbolton. Brown brought Ye Olde Pub in for a landing that was more of a controlled crash. With no landing gear, he had to belly flop the plane onto the runway. The screech of metal on tarmac was a horrifying, grinding sound, but the plane held together. It skidded to a stop, and a profound, deafening silence descended upon the wreckage. Charlie Brown and the surviving members of his crew had made it home. They had flown through the very gates of hell and lived to tell the tale. But the story of the German pilot who refused to fire was a secret they would have to keep. When Brown debriefed his commanding officer, he told the full, unvarnished story. He described the crippled state of his plane, the dead and wounded, and the mysterious German fighter who had escorted them to safety. The officer listened intently, his face growing increasingly grim as Brown spoke. When Brown was finished, the officer gave him a direct, non-negotiable order. "Forget it ever happened. Don't tell anyone. Not your crew, not your friends, not anyone." The reason was simple and brutally pragmatic. The story was too dangerous. If it got out, it could be used by the Germans for propaganda purposes, to show that even their airmen were merciful and chivalrous, a stark contrast to the terror bombing the Allies were accused of. It could also encourage other German pilots to spare American bombers, which might sound like a good thing, but it could also be seen as a sign of weakness, a crack in the Allied resolve. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of total war, mercy was a complication that could not be afforded. So, the incredible story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown was buried, classified as a military secret, locked away in the archives of a forgotten moment in history. For Charlie Brown, it became a personal quest, a debt of honour that he knew he could never truly repay, but one that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The war ended. Both men, on opposite sides of the world, had survived the carnage. Franz Stigler, who never did get that 23rd kill for the Knight's Cross, eventually moved to Canada, building a new life for himself as a successful businessman in Vancouver. He never forgot the crippled B-17, the image of the wounded airman seared into his memory like a brand. He rarely spoke of it, a secret act of kindness that he kept locked away in his heart, a private moment of honour in a public life of war. Charlie Brown returned to his home in West Virginia, got married, raised a family, and built a successful career as a diplomat and a power plant manager. He lived the American dream, but the memory of the German pilot haunted him, a beautiful, ghostly presence in the back of his mind. He felt a profound sense of gratitude and a burning curiosity that would not fade with the passing years. Who was this man? Why did he do it? He owed his life, and the lives of his crew, to this unknown enemy. He felt a need, a spiritual obligation, to find him, to thank him, to close the circle on that incredible day in the skies over Germany. For over 40 years, Brown searched. It became a quiet, relentless quest, a personal mission that defined a part of his life. He wrote letters to aviation magazines, posted inquiries in military newsletters, and contacted German pilot associations, following every faint lead, every whisper of a similar story. He was a man looking for a ghost, for a name to put to the face he had seen through a shattered windshield in 1943. He described the event to anyone who would listen, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would know the pilot of the Bf-109 with the shark's mouth. Then, in 1986, a miracle. A friend of Brown's, who was also a pilot, happened to see a small advertisement in a monthly newsletter for fighter pilots. It was a letter from a German veteran living in Canada, a man named Franz Stigler, who was looking for information about the B-17 he had escorted over Germany on that very day, December 20th, 1943. He too had been haunted by the memory, wondering if the American crew had ever made it home. Brown's friend immediately contacted him, and for the first time, Charlie Brown had a name. He wrote to Stigler, and when the letter arrived in Canada, Franz Stigler knew he had found his lost bomber crew. In 1990, they finally met. It was a quiet, unassuming meeting in a hotel room in Florida, a world away from the frozen skies over Germany. The two old men, one American, one German, looked at each other across a small table. There were no uniforms, no medals, no guns. There were just two veterans, two old pilots, finally coming face to face with their shared history. Brown reached out his hand and said, "It's been a long time." Stigler took it, his eyes filled with emotion, and replied, "I knew you would make it." In that moment, 47 years of silence and wondering were broken. They were no longer enemies. They were brothers, bound by a single, extraordinary act of compassion. Their friendship blossomed in the years that followed. They became inseparable, travelling together, sharing their story at air shows and military reunions, becoming living symbols of reconciliation and hope. They proved that the humanity that connects us is far more powerful than the ideologies that divide us. When Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, Charlie Brown was by his side. When Charlie Brown passed away just a few months later, he was buried with full military honours, his eulogy delivered by a friend who spoke of the incredible debt he owed to a German pilot. Their story is a testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times, in the midst of a war that defined an era by its brutality and inhumanity, a single act of grace can change everything. It is a story that defied the logic of war and the orders of high command. It was a secret that was kept for decades, not out of shame, but out of necessity, until the world was ready to hear it. In the end, their story is not just about a pilot who spared a bomber. It is about the moment when two men, flying machines of war, chose peace instead of destruction, and in doing so, taught the world a lesson it would never forget. It is the story of how a German fighter pilot and an American bomber crew became enemies for a moment and friends for a lifetime.